Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we are taking on a subject that really shapes nations and determines futures, military doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
It is, it's essentially the operational DNA of an army. It's the philosophy that dictates how, when, and I think most importantly, why it fights.
And whether or not it even expects to win in the traditions.
Exactly. So what happens when that foundational DNA isn't just tweaked a little bit, but is fundamentally rewritten by, let's call it an intellectual...
And that's really our focus today. We are looking at a critical and incredibly contentious pivot point in Israeli military history, starting back in the early 1990s.
Okay.
This was a moment when these deeply ingrained traditional ideas of decisive warfare, the kind that had secured these massive victories in the past.
Right, the stuff of legend.
Exactly. It all just suddenly collides head-on with these new, messy political realities. We're talking specifically about the post-Oslo Accords environment and this terrifying decentralized rise of urban terrorism.
And this deep dive really centers around a single, highly influential, and as we're about to see, a highly controversial figure, Dr. Shimon Naveh.
Mm-hmm.
He was a philosopher, really, who managed to shape an entire military institution of enormous power. This was the Institute for Campaign Research, better known by its Hebrew acronym MALTA.
Khan Leheker Hama Arak. And Maltam's whole purpose, its reason for being, was to drag the IDF's senior rank, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the 21st century by, modernizing their strategic thinking.
And the sources we have for this deep dive are, they're just explosive because they're not sanitized academic papers.
No, not at all.
They contain these frank, unvarnished internal conversations, some really deep critiques from people inside. And they paint a picture of a severe doctrinal and I'd say institutional crisis.
Yeah.
So here's the hook. This is the shocking claim that really runs through these frames our entire investigation. This new theoretical shift, driven by Naveh's systemic, limited goal approach, is alleged to have utterly emasculated.
Oh.
In the brutal words of one source reflecting on this period, it turned the IDF rotten, sick army.
That is an incredible charge. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, our sources actually capture Naveh himself in private, expressing this just utter and profound contempt for the very system he was supposed to be serving.
What?
He claimed openly that he intended to do his own theory because he felt the existing military structure was fundamentally worthless.
So this is not just a story about military strategy. It's a story about how powerful ideas, philosophical influence, and one man's vision can shake the foundations of national security at the very highest levels.
And with real and, in many people's views, absolutely disastrous consequences down the line.
Okay, so let's unpack the context first. Why the sudden need for this radical shift? Armies are generally really resistant to change. What was happening on the ground in the early 90s that made the IDF's traditional maneuver-based doctrine suddenly obsolete, or at least highly...
Well, the primary challenge was this dramatic and almost instantaneous shift in the threat landscape. For decades, the IDF was structured and trained for large-scale, conventional, state-on-state border wars.
Right. Think 1967, 1973, tanks in the desert.
Exactly. They were masters of engaging hostile state armies across defined international lines using armor, massive air superiority, and this deep, decisive maneuver warfare. But after the first Intifada and leading into the Oslo process in the early 90s, the entire operational reality just flipped on its head.
The desert gave way to the alleyway.
That's a great way to put it. The sources describe this grim pivot to a new reality defined by exploding buses, unprecedented suicide attacks, and terror operations conducted deep inside crowded Israeli civilian areas.
So the operational environment just violently shrinks from open deserts and external borders to these densely populated cities and villages within the West Bank and Gaza.
And this presented two massive, interconnected, and nearly insurmountable problems for the existing command structure.
Okay.
First, you had the technical challenge of fighting a new kind of enemy that's embedded in the civilian population. How do you conduct effective military operations? We're talking counter-terror raids, security patrols, arrests inside a complex, urban, civilian-populated environment without causing massive collateral damage.
Which instantly risks international condemnation.
Instantly. The old methods of just overwhelming force and armor maneuvers were simply too clumsy, too destructive, and ultimately they were counterproductive in this sensitive, enclosed environment.
Which brings us to the second, and I think maybe the more profound problem, this crisis legitimacy. And that was inseparable from the political atmosphere that the Oslo Accords created.
Exactly. The Oslo process, even though it was aimed at peace, created this immediate conceptual disaster for the military. This new type of warfare inside populated areas, it lacked clear political legitimacy for deep, sustained incursion, especially when those operations required crossing internal lines of demarcation.
And our sources specifically mention the difficulties around the BA line. Let's just pause on that for a second, because for our listener, this is a key technical. It was a conceptual boundary, right? Not just a line on a map.
It was a historical demarcation of operational control. So crossing a line like that wasn't just a geographic move. It was a major political technical dilemma.
Right.
So commanders now face this massive hurdle. The chain of command was constantly questioning whether the political echelon, the government, would even approve a necessary operation.
Or worse, whether an operation they thought was necessary would just be immediately withdrawn because of political pressure or some international outcry.
Precisely. So commanders needed a brand new operational logic, one that accounted for all these political constraints, the perpetual threat of international oversight, and the constant presence of non-combat. The military needed this profound conceptual shift to define the new political military camp.
So the existing educational and command structure, the one designed to train officers for tank battles in the Sinai, it just couldn't handle this intellectual and political pivot. And that's what led to the institutional shift that gave birth to Maltam.
That's the institutional lineage, exactly. Before Maltam, the professional training body for senior ranks, we're talking majors and up, the individuals who were destined for the general staff was called PU, the IDF Command and Staff College. After the Oslo Accords, the establishment basically concluded that this traditional structure was insufficient. It needed a total overhaul to address this dynamic, unpredictable, and, politically charged strategic environment.
And Maltam was born as the intellectual replacement.
The Institute for Campaign Research was created specifically to force this intellectual adaptation. The central idea, and it was a noble idea, was that the new environment required high-level, systemic, strategic thinking. It demanded a redefinition of operational logic and the concept of the campaign itself, that crucial layer of strategy that connects, tactical battlefield movements to the overarching political goal.
And who specifically got the job of designing this new intellect?
Well, the Institute was established by General Dovik Tamari, who was a well-regarded figure. But critically, he brought in Dr. Shimon Naveh. And Naveh arrived, bringing his very specific intellectual framework, which he called the theory of the campaign, or TMA. He was given this immense task of educating the next generation of commanders, the very individuals who, as our sources note, would fundamentally shape the IDF command structure, its operational focus, and its ultimate success or failure for the next 3 decades.
It sounds less like a typical military college and more like some kind of intellect crucible designed to forge new strategic mind, moving the military from a focus on, sheer operational brawn to this complex, modern strategic thinking.
That was certainly the lofty aspiration. But the core question, the one we're really digging into today, based on these frank sources, is whether the philosophy they imported and implemented was actually suitable for the unique existential operational reality of a small besieged.
Okay, let's delve into Naveh himself, because he is the intellectual center of this entire doctrine. He was clearly not a typical product of the IDF rank structure.
Not at all.
He was a philosopher, a highly educated intellectual. Our sources confirm his roots. Born in Hadera, he started with the paratroopers in 1960, so he had that early elite combat grounding. But his later focus was purely theoretical and historical.
His academic foundation was, formidable. He held a doctorate, and he specialized in analyzing the campaign domain historically. He focused on dissecting these large-scale military strategies, particularly those used by the Soviet and German sides during the titanic conflicts of World War II.
He was an analyst of continental mass-scale military history.
Yes.
And this brings us to the provocative details in our sources regarding the Russian connection.
Yeah, this detail is essential for understanding the theoretical structure he ended up imposing. The sources claim, and this is a really striking point, that Naveh spent time in Russia at what is described as a KGB university.
A KGB university?
That's the term used. And he openly referred to the Russian chief of staff as a profound intellectual reference point for him. This context is critical because it explains the lens through which he viewed military strategy, a lens derived directly from the Soviet system.
Okay, so what's the big philosophical implication of importing a doctrine that's influenced by the Soviet military machine and trying to graft it onto the IDF?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the sources actually concede that Naveh's historical analysis, if you look at it in isolation, was fundamentally sound. The theory of maneuvering massive forces across vast fronts was academically solid.
What?
But the problem, as it's articulated in the source material, was the attempt to impose this grand theory derived from a different culture, different theory, and a massive different geographical reality onto the IDF.
Right. The Soviet Union was famously willing to sacrifice millions of lives to achieve its objective. The concept of manpower as a limitless, disposable resource was just baked into.
And that is diametrically opposed to the values, the constraints, and the realities of a small, Western-aligned democratic military like the IDF, where every single life is politically and socially precious.
So it's a complete mismatch in value.
Precise. The sources highlight that the adoption of this foreign worldview essentially warped the minds of many in the military establishment because it abstracted the problem of war into systems. It just ignored the moral and human constraints that define a small, high-tech, democratic army. The doctrine was fundamentally detached from the unique political, social, and demographic realities of Israel.
So if he was bringing in these massive, complex foreign theory, he had to introduce a new conceptual language to teach them. This wasn't standard military jargon anymore.
Not at all. That's where the concept of systemic thinking, or yeshiva marakit, came into play.
Okay.
Naveh utilized these highly specialized concepts in text, often drawing from French post-national philosophers, and the discourse of complexity. He introduced a specialized lexicon that was utterly unfamiliar and often opaque to professional military officers.
I can imagine.
I mean, these were men who'd spent their entire careers focusing on practical command, logistics, and maneuver warfare, not reading abstract political theory or post-structuralist texts in their formative years. It was an impossible intellectual jump for many.
Let's try to define this systemic thinking simply for the list. What did Yeshiva Marakit demand that traditional linear military...
Well, traditional doctrine is essentially linear, right? You identify the enemy, you define the objective victory, you mobilize resources, you execute the plan. It's a straight line from A to B.
Simple enough.
Systemic thinking, however, views the battlefield not as a linear contest, but as this dynamic, complex web of interconnected, non-military variables.
So it's not just about the enemy soldiers.
Exactly. It asks, how does a specific tactical maneuver, say placing a checkpoint, influence international media, local politics, internal Palestinian dynamics, the funding streams from Europe, and military objective? It treats the entire conflict as a living, self-regulating ecosystem.
So the goal is less about winning a discrete battle and more about managing the stability of the entire...
Exactly. And the challenge is that while it's mathematically brilliant, this approach often paralyzes decision-making because every single action have a dozen unpredictable, non-military ripple effects that have to be modeled and mitigated.
And this highly theoretical approach defined Naveh's persona as a teacher, a philosopher, not a...
Yes, which brings us to his infamous, absolutely brutal pedagogical style. The sources detail how his methods of teaching often involve just humiliating his students.
How so?
His role, as he saw it, was to shade the foundation of their thinking, but his execution was notoriously condescending. He saw himself as the intellectual superior, and this role of philosopher teacher often placed the officer in front of him, often high-ranking, experienced warfighters, in an extremely awkward and deeply subordinate intellectual position.
Their decades of practical experience in Naveh's class plus...
That's the message they got. We have specific, shocking anecdotes about how he began his lectures.
Let's hear one.
The sources reveal that in his introductory lecture to cohorts of high-ranking officers, Naveh's opening gambit was this: "Friends, you are all fools, all idiots. Maybe one or two of you will manage to understand what I am saying."
You're kidding me. He said that to senior officers.
Word for word. He used extremely coarse and aggressive language, displaying, in the words of the source, very, very frank contempt for those standing opposite him, even for commanders who had fought bravely and achieved high rank and command positions.
That's just astonishing for a teacher to start a professional course with such an aggressive posture, essentially telling students that their entire life's work is irrelevant.
It was intellectual dominance weaponized. If students, maybe trying to save face or just genuinely engage, challenged him using common academic or professional military discourse, his response was immediate and dismissive.
What would he say?
He'd say they were attempting to butt heads. They don't understand. They don't know anything. The source suggests that while Naveh was a great teacher and many officers learned tremendously about the complexity of command, his methods instilled this massive conceptual confusion and a sense of intellectual inferiority that persisted throughout their careers.
So they knew he was brilliant, but they also knew they could language. Okay, let's connect the philosophy to the out. If Naveh successfully imposed this new philosophical language and this systemic thinking on the military elite, the individuals running the IDF for the next generation, what did this doctrine fundamentally change about the purpose of this? Is the shift from academic theory to the Army's soul?
The change was, truly existential for the military's self-perception. As we discussed, the Oslo Accords created a strategic reality where the traditional rules of war just no longer apply. The Palestinians were suddenly redefined by the political echelon. They were no longer strictly the enemy in the conventional sense of a hostile state power to be decisively defeated.
They became, in this Maltem systemic view, an occupied population whose strategic disposition had to be managed, not crushed.
And that transformation changed everything about the military mandate.
Yeah.
The military's traditional role shifted drastically from fighting, crushing, and winning toward maintaining or achieving a state of politically constrained peace or stability. The new goal was redefined not as victory, but as limited confrontation.
Managing risk rather than taking decisive action.
Precisely.
And this is exactly where the source materials claim that the Army emasculated begins to truly crystallize. The ultimate, primal, military goal decisive victory was conceptually removed from the mission state, replaced by some complex calculation.
Absolutely. The focus shifted from destroying the enemy to managing the environment. Instead of seeking decisive victory, the military's task became narrowly focused on exhausting the terrorists and containing the violence to politically manageable levels.
And the massive new constraint imposed was ensuring the Army did not commit an international incident.
That became the prime direct. The primary concern for operations became preventing political fallout or international embarrassment, and that often superseded the objective of swiftly eliminating an immediate threat.
So the core military value of victory, that fundamental motivator that drives military life, recruitment, morale, it was compromised. The objective was no longer to eliminate the enemy and end the war, but merely to sustain the conflict in a controlled, limited manner and wear down the opposition over time.
And this had enormous implications for the command structure and for personnel development.
Yeah.
Officers undergoing MOLTAM training were not being molded into decisive war commanders focused on closing with and destroying the enemy.
No, they were being shaped into statesmen and managers of complexity. Military thinkers whose primary job was to navigate political nuance, manage international media perceptions, and influence the tenuous peace process, often at the expense of operational clarity and decisiveness.
It created a generation of commanders who were simultaneously strategists, diplomats, and PR managers. And the sources confirm this. They note that this new perspective influenced the command structure for the next 3 decades, creating a high command that was preoccupied with this macro-level management rather than micro-level combat proficiency.
The source provides a really powerful case study for how this worked in practice, citing the experience of the central then headed by General.
Dayan was cited as one of the first and most prominent commanders who deeply internalized the Maltem Naveh shift. He recognized that the theories fundamentally altered the entire conceptual basis of warfare he had learned.
And he was operating right in the heart of it, in Judea and Samaria.
Exactly, the heart of the new conflict. He had to adapt to this doctrine in real time under intense pressure.
And the sources describe the cognitive dissonance this created during the height of the Second Intifada, a period characterized by these horrific suicide bombings and massacres. So what was the high command preoccupied?
The revelation from these internal documents is startling. The senior echelon, during the period when citizens were being slaughtered in buses and malls, was not just focused on eliminating the immediate tactical threat to Israeli citizens.
What else could they be focused?
They were simultaneously engaged in these complex, high-level strategic debates, trying to figure out how to return Arafat to the peace track.
Wait, while bombs were going off. That is a staggering disconnect. The military leadership was effectively splitting its focus, half on fighting, half on high-level diplomacy.
It shows the successful implementation of systemic thinking. The military had internalized the idea that its job wasn't just physical security, it was also the political maintenance of the entire system.
Right.
They viewed the campaign as dynamic and constantly changing, incorporating inputs from Jordan, America, Europe, internal Israeli politics, even specific internal groups like the settlers. The military had stopped being a sharp instrument of the state focused on defined victory and had become this overly complicated management organization, beholden to all these external systemic constraints.
They were fighting a war they weren't sure they were allowed to win decisively.
That's it in a nutshell. So here's where the tension between the theory and the tradition becomes brutally evident. This fundamental shift, importing complex foreign doctrine and conceptually removing victory as the primary goal, it did not happen quietly.
I can't imagine it would.
There was severe internal resistance, especially from combat veterans, who viewed this conceptual drift not just as academic folly, but as profoundly dangerous to the nation's security.
And the resistance came from the very top. We have the example of the Dan Shomron report from 1994, which was published only shortly after Maltem's creation. He was a former chief of staff, a man whose judgment carried massive.
Shomron authored what the sources call a comprehensive and deadly report on Maltem's influence. His core finding was a prophetic warning. He wrote that over the preceding decade, the IDF had gradually detached itself from the foundations upon which its warfare had been based since its founding and which were at the root of its success.
Wow. So he recognized almost immediately that Maltam wasn't just some postgraduate research institute for academics.
Yeah.
It was the intellectual engine dictating the future operational concept of the entire army, and he saw the threat this posed to traditional military effects.
Absolutely. Shamran saw that this academic theory, disconnected from practical decisive maneuver, had begun to permeate the command structure. It was fundamentally eroding the basic principles that had historically led to decisive victory: clarity of mission, clear political mandate, and the operational value of ground control and decisive maneuver.
He warned that the military was losing its internal compass.
He did, but Dr. Naveh, the intellectual purist, seemed to operate in an environment where these critiques meant very little.
Right. His private contempt for the very individuals he trained who went on to become staff and generals is remarkable. The private recordings expose this brutal, demeaning view of the topship, a sort of academic nihilism.
Yeah. The sources reveal Naveh's massive private contempt for his own students who achieved the highest rank. When he was discussing the then Chief of Staff, Moshe Yaalon, Naveh made this stunning, layered critique.
Okay.
He started by claiming that Yaalon proves you don't need to be smart to be a good COS, which is already a backhanded compliment of the highest order, competent but intellectually lacking.
But then he negates even that faint praise.
He immediately negated any positive assessment by calling Yaalon an idiot and a fool, and directly blamed him for massive institutional damage, specifically for destroying the reserve.
That is the ultimate display of intellectual arrogance, acknowledging someone's professional capacity while simultaneously dismissing their intelligence and blaming them for systemic failure.
It is.
But doesn't this expose a profound hypocrisy? I mean, Naveh was the philosopher who shaped their thinking. If the commander who followed the advice and internalized the systemic doctrine is an idiot and a fool, doesn't that inherently suggest the philosophy itself is flawed, not just the student?
Sure.
The philosophy led the idiot.
That is the ultimate paradox of this era. The theoretical structure provided by Naveh was so convincing, so intellectually powerful in a period of uncertainty, that it created this completely dysfunctional dynamic. Commanders who were called idiots and fools by their own mentor still listened to him because he was deemed the source of true strategic wisdom.
So it reveals a command culture where intellectual superiority trumped practical experience and even common sense.
It does. And moving to the political end of the spectrum, Naveh's political conclusions are clear, and they flow directly from his philosophical rejection of traditional control. He supports the establishment of a Palestinian state, believing they have the right to self-determination.
And his views are stated explicitly in the source.
Yes. The long-term systemic solution must be a state-to-state agreement, acknowledging the Palestinians as a distinct strategic entity with the right to self-determinate. This is the logical endpoint of his theory, which views the conflict as a political system to be managed through diplomacy and separation, not a military conflict to be solved by ground.
And his personal experience cemented this view. The sources note his powerful emotional reaction to the physical mechanisms of the occupation.
He described visiting Judea and Samaria in 2006, and saying the physical reality of the occupation barriers, the roadblocks, the bypass road, was personally unbearable. He stated unequivocally, "I cannot see this. It is absolutely not okay."
Which underscores a military theorist whose strategic conclusions were heavily influenced by his personal philosophical and political aversion to the physical mechanism.
Right. And his final military conclusion, the one that filtered deep into the training, ground control in warfare is far less important than it once was.
Which became a hallmark of the Maltam approach.
Exactly. His thesis suggested that physical control over territory was strategically diminished in the age of global complexity and long-range weaponry. And this belief, it taught generations of officers that deep, decisive ground maneuver was obsolete or, at best, a necessary evil to be avoided, not a core path to victory.
So the ultimate test of any doctrine is the crucible of war. And for the Maltem-trained generation of high command, that crucible was the Second Lebanon War in 2000. This was the moment of truth for the systemic, limited-goal approach.
And the test, according to our sources and all the subsequent official investigations, resulted in a catastrophic failure. The conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon served as the ultimate disastrous examination of the new doctrine.
What specifically went wrong? I mean, the sources describe the operational reality as bizarre, marked by this profound confusion in the ranks.
The high command, just paralyzed by systemic thinking and the focus on political outcome, lacked a clear, decisive operational plan. We hear accounts of ground troops entering villages, leaving, and then re-entering them repeatedly.
A strategy that would utterly confuse the field commanders and exhaust the soldiers.
Of course. There was no clear strategic guidance from the top as to the operational objective. The goal was containment, not destruction, and that diffused mission translated into tactical chaos. The high command was micromanaging based on political constraints rather than focusing on military execution.
So we see this grim paradox. The sources note that many of the successes that did occur during the war were credited entirely to the combatants and the lower-level field command.
The captains and majors.
Right. acting on initiative and returning instinctively to traditional decisive military principles. It was a bottom-up success against a top-down theoretical failure.
The field commanders were acting despite the doctrine. They were relying on what the military had historically done well, not what Maltem had taught them they should do.
And this failure was exacerbated by the changing nature of the enemy, which is something Maltem should have been uniquely positioned to address, but failed spectacularly.
Yeah, the old reality was that strategic power required massive national infrastructure, tank, plane, submarine.
But now, non-state actors like Hezbollah had acquired strategic capability through what you could call technological democratization.
Precise. They could buy a Toyota pickup truck and acquire cheap, globally accessible rockets online. The sources stress that the global abundance of accessible weaponry means any small organization can conduct strategic activity without needing a state budget.
Right.
And the Maltem Doctrine focused on limited confrontation and managing the system. It provided no clear operational mechanism for dealing with a non-state actor that was successfully targeting Israeli cities and undermining national resilience. They had defined the enemy as a complex variable to be managed rather than a military threat to be eliminated.
And the public outcry over the military and political failures of that war meant it led to the established Winograd conducted an exhaustive,
The committee's verdict was exceptionally damning and multifaceted. They determined that the war was a systemic failure resulting from poor management by both the political and military echelon, poor execution by ground forces, and poor underlying readiness. They indicted the entire top-down structure.
But crucially, the committee delivered a direct, explicit institutional condemnation of Maltem and Naveh's underlying doctrine. They didn't just criticize the tack, criticized the philosophy.
Absolutely. The Winograd Committee pointed an accusing finger at the High Command's intellectual preparation, finding significant weakness in dedication to the mission. They linked this philosophical weakness directly to the limited goal approach that had permeated the system over the previous decade.
And this doctrinal rot, they stressed, had partially trickled down, spread to the fight, affecting their morale.
They concluded that the High Command had lost sight of the core military imperative. They stressed the belief in the justice of the war was insufficient. What was also essential was belief in the necessity of victory. When the High Command prioritizes the management of political outcomes and international optics over decisive military defeat, the will to fight is corroded. The military ceases to understand its primary role. The source material suggests this was the final official confirmation of the dangers Dan Shomron had warned about over a decade earlier.
And this external validation of the internal critique led to the end of the
It did. Following the Winograd Committee's criticism and a subsequent state controller's report detailing the specific operational and command failures, Maltem was closed down.
And Naveh's reaction.
Dr. Naveh, true to his intellectual arrogance, reportedly dismissed the closure as completely unnecessary, asserting that the institute's original establishment was vital, even if many students failed to fully grasp the material. He maintained the validity of the intellectual endeavor despite the catastrophic results in practice.
Unbelievable.
So Maltem was shut down, but the necessity for advanced study of campaign-level strategy remained. Maltem was eventually replaced by the Dato Institute, which still exists today.
But the sources suggest that Dato has not inherited Maltem's powerful, almost cult-like philosophical influence on the highest rank.
And that is the key difference. The insight provided suggests that Dato's influence on actual military discourse and operational practice is marginal or even non-existent compared to Maltem's peak years.
So it's more of a think tank now.
Essentially, yeah. Dato performs necessary research, but it lacks the philosophical control and the mandatory curriculum that shaped an entire generation of chiefs of staff and generals. The pendulum has swung back toward utility over theory.
So we have the theoretical failure of Maltem, culminating in the 2006 war. What was the operational model that did succeed, the one that proved the Maltem approach was wrong for the realities of the time? The sources argue the Maltem doctrine became irrelevant after Operation Defensive Shield.
Defensive Shield, which was launched in 2002 at the height of the Second Intifada, represented a fundamental, practical rejection of the limited attrition-based philosophy that Maltem promoted.
How so?
The IDF, under renewed necessity, reoccupied and reestablished comprehensive security control in Judea and Samaria.
This operation, driven by existential necessity rather than abstract, forced a practical, tactical, and strategic overhaul based on clear objectives.
It led to the creation of a new strategic document for fighting terrorism and guerrilla warfare within a civilian population, a crucial concept that the sources argue should also be directly applied in conflicts like Gaza.
So what was the key lesson?
The key lesson extracted from Defensive Shield 1, based on practical, successful operational experience rather than abstract foreign theory, was the necessity of ground control, clear political military objectives, and decisive, sustained action to eliminate threats and reestablish security. This return to foundational, decisive military principles effectively replaced the Maltem approach in the field. even before the institute was officially shuttered.
And yet, despite the catastrophic failure evidenced in the Second Lebanon War and the institute's eventual closure, Naveh remains revered by many of the How can that paradox persist? How can a failed theorist still be hailed as a genius?
It really speaks to the mesmerizing power of intellectual authority in a confusing environment. Naveh provided a grand, unifying, sophisticated theory, a comprehensive language, at a time when the high command felt utterly lost and directionless.
Right.
He was viewed as the smartest man in the room, offering coherence where before there was only chaos. So the loyalty stems from the feeling of having been initiated into a higher strategic truth.
But the outcome, according to the sources, is bleak.
The bleak takeaway is this. The Army, by losing its way conceptually, stopped thinking about decisive victory as an absolute requirement. It stopped dealing with the inherent terrible cost of achieving that victory. They began to believe that cost and political complexity were not the commander's primary concern, but the politician, thereby abstracting the military role away from warfighting and into systemic management.
So the core conflict, the fundamental tension in this entire story, is between a highly philosophical, almost political doctrine, the theory of the campaign, focused on systemic management, and the practical, primal requirement of a fighting force, which needs clear goals, decisive action, and a will to win.
Yes.
Naveh's philosophy ultimately emasculated the army of its will to win, turning it from a decisive force into one focused on politically constrained attrition and limited goals.
The ultimate measure of a military structure is its ability to provide clear, actionable answers to the political echelon. I can achieve this military goal or I cannot. When the military loses that clarity and begins to define its role as managing political outcomes or international perception, it ceases to be a functional war machine. The theoretical ambition of Multem exceeded its operational utility, resulting in a crisis of faith and competence.
What an incredible deep dive into the architecture of modern military. We've seen how a highly educated philosophical figure, influenced by geopolitical and military theory, far removed from the immediate kinetic local realities of the Middle East, managed to reshape an entire generation of military.
With lasting, and in many views, disastrous consequences that cost lives and undermine national security.
What's fascinating here is how the definition of war itself and the means to conclude it became a political question handled by military through a theoretical framework.
Instead of adhering to the basic military requirement, providing a clear answer I can or I cannot regarding the decisive defeat of the enemy, the entire strategic discussion pivoted away from military capability and into political necessity and constraint.
The story of Multem is just a potent, vital reminder that the theories taught in classrooms or imported from foreign context have very real, very bloody consequences when they're applied to the ideas matter, and bad ideas in high command.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. You've heard how Naveh's theory of the campaign was influenced by the rise of non-state actors organizations that could achieve strategic effect without state infrastructure. So, if war no longer requires massive national machinery like tanks and jets, but simply a few guys with a Toyota and cheap rockets bought online, thus neutralizing traditional state advantages, what does the concept of victory even mean for modern nation-states today? What kind of doctrine replaces the quest for decisive victory when the enemy's resources are diffuse, cheap, and easily replaced in a constant low-level conflict?
Something profound to mull over until our next deep dive. You know how this works. You give us the sources, often complex, sometimes contradictory, and we try to unpack them to get to the core of what they're claiming.
And today, we are wading into some extremely sensitive territory, really controversial stuff.
Yeah, we are. We're looking at a set of claims about a long-term, maybe even systemic transformation in the core philosophy of the Israeli establishment. We're talking mainly about the IDF. And this isn't just about, tactics or weapon systems. The sources allege a profound intellectual shift, a drift that has, according to its critics, reshaped national security for decades.
That's exactly right. Our source material presents this really detailed and deeply critical analysis. It all focuses on the claims around one single powerful academic figure, a man named Shimon Naveh.
Right.
And this hugely influential doctrine he apparently propagated, which is known as the Shitat Naveh, or the Naveh Method.
Okay, so what's the big claim? What's the core contention?
It's revolutionary, really. The claim is that this method fundamentally changed the IDF's mission over generations of commanders. It systematically pushed the military away from the goal of achieving a decisive victory.
You mean like winning a war?
Exactly, winning. In Hebrew, you'd say nitzakon, or hakra, decisive defeat of the enemy. The claim is that those concepts were pushed aside.
And replaced with what?
Replaced with a focus on political orchestration, risk management, and this idea of a perpetual negotiated compromise called limited confrontation.
So this alleged philosophical rewiring would impact everything, wouldn't it? From how a soldier is trained all the way up to a war cabinet.
Everything. That's the argument.
So our mission today is, just to be clear with everyone listening, we are going to impartially distill what the sources are claiming, how this philosophy was supposedly taught, which high-profile leaders adopted it, and what the asserted consequences are.
And the sources claim those consequences are often catastrophic.
Right. So we're sticking strictly to the detailed, provocative content you've given us. We're treating these claims as a crucial window into a powerful institutional, not as our own opinion.
It's an examination of how these powerful intellectual currents inside the high command are claimed to have, slowly, bit by bit, reshaped the entire national strategy. And the source argues this led to a breakdown of both strategic clarity and, maybe more importantly, accountability. Our job is to give you the full, unfiltered claim being made.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack this stuff. Before we can even understand the method, we have to understand who is the central figure, Shimon Naveh, and how did he, according to the source, maintain such a powerful gravitational pull over so many top commanders? So
Naveh is presented as the undeniable figurehead of this whole school of thought. He's described in the source material almost paradoxically as a guru for many of the most influential officers in the country.
A guru? Why is that a paradox?
Well, the paradox, which the source really hammers home, is that Naveh is closely linked to what the source calls the great failure of the Second Lebanon War back in 2006.
Wait a minute, hold on. If he's associated with a massive, catastrophic military failure, how on earth does he keep his status as an intellectual guru for the establishment? That seems like a huge contradiction.
It is.
Why didn't that operational disaster, permanently discredit him?
And that is the central tension the source material highlights. The critique is that Naveh was, in fact, initially dismissed from the IDF right after the Second Lebanon War, a war that many critics blamed on exactly this kind of flawed strategic thinking, on an inability to adapt.
So he was out.
He was out. But apparently the intellectual utility of his method, or you can say the intellectual commitment of his students who were rising through the rank, proved stronger than the operational failure itself.
So his ideas had already taken root.
Deep roots. And the source claims that a former chief of staff, Benny Gantz, reportedly brought him back into the fold around 2013. That move effectively rehabilitated Naveh's standing within the institutional hierarchy.
So the influence never really went away. It just, went underground for a few years before being officially brought back by one of his own prominent students.
That's the claim. Exactly. And the source alleges this influence is still very much active today. Naveh apparently continues to engage with and influence key senior officers, and not just in the IDF. The sources specifically mention his teachings, reaching the inner circles of the Shin Bet, that's the Shabak, internal security, and the Mossad, foreign intelligence.
So how does he maintain this? Is he running some kind of massive official military college?
Not anymore. That's the interesting part. The source says he operates through these unique, highly selective boutique university forums.
Boutique university? What does that mean?
Think of them as small, intimate gatherings, very exclusive, often involving the country's most senior security. And in these forums, they analyze global battles, strategic theory, complex geopolitical situations.
So it's direct access to the top.
Direct and exclusive. This setup ensures his philosophy isn't just trickling down through official channels. It's being delivered directly to those already at the very apex of the security pyramid. It functions, in a way, like an intellectual finishing school for the top tier of the entire security state.
Okay, so let's get to the philosophy itself. The source uses this truly incredible phrase to define the ideal officer under this doctrine. They call the officer, or the mitzbin, an artist of deception, oman hatabula in Hebrew.
Yes.
What is the operational definition of deception of tabula in this context? Because that sounds like more than just tricking the enemy on the battlefield.
It is so much more. And this is where the source's critique becomes truly explosive. The deception, the tabula, is defined in extraordinarily broad terms. The source explicitly claims the officer is taught to engage in deception aimed not only at the adversary, who they call the red echelon.
Right, the enemy.
But also, and this is the critical part, at himself and his community and everyone.
Deception against his own community and himself. That sounds like a recipe for, chronic internal mistrust, or maybe an intentional blurring of reality for some institutional purpose.
Well, the source suggests it stems from this new, expanded role of the officer.
The commander of states.
Exactly. If a commander sees himself as the ultimate strategist and the gatekeeper of the state, rather than, a simple executor of government orders, then managing public perception and minimizing political interference become paramount.
So deception is a tool for control.
It's a tool for strategic control. The source paints a picture of a system where the commander believes he knows the real truth, the deeper truth, and so he feels he must manipulate all the variables, including public and political understanding, to guide events in what he sees as the right direction.
That intellectual justification for manipulation, it leads right into the next and maybe the most controversial claim about this tabula. The source alleges Naveh's view is that security officials must actively act against and collect intelligence on elected officials, the blue political tier.
Precisely. And the critique is staggering. Security officials, according to Naveh's stated view as cited by the source, should not just collect intelligence against the enemy, the red. In fact, the source says that's considered the easy part, static intelligence.
Right.
The doctrine allegedly teaches that they must be more sophisticated in collecting intelligence on the democratic civilian political layer, the blue echelon.
Hold on a second, just so I'm hearing this correct. You are saying the source alleges that the security establishment is being instructed to gather intelligence on the very government constitutionally sworn to serve.
That's the claim.
I mean, that is the literal definition of a deep structural challenge to democratic governance, to civilian control of the military. What could possibly be the justification for treating your own political leadership as an intelligence?
The justification, according to the source's analysis of the doctrine, is this concept of the officer as a gatekeeper. They operate within the state, and they see the elected officials as, well, as transient, politically motivated, maybe volatile or reckless.
And the officer is the steady.
The officer, by contrast, views himself as the stable, professional steward of long-term national security. So in their view, they must understand the political echelon's weaknesses, their moves, their intentions, almost as if the government is a parallel power structure that needs to be monitored and, if necessary, neutralized if its actions are deemed detrimental to the state.
So if the doctrine is centered on this kind of political maneuvering and deception, it has to change the military.
Which brings us to the core claim you mentioned earlier, the abandonment of victory. If commanders are acting as these sophisticated political operators, what happens to the classic military concept of nitzikon, victory?
According to the source, it gets erased. The claim is that over a long period, they trace it back 30 years to the creation of that malach and say it accelerated over the last. The concept of victory, nitzikon, and decisive defeat, hakra, were systematically and intellectually erased from the military's vocabulary.
To erase the concept of victory from a military's doctrine, that seems to remove the primary reason for a fighting force to even exist.
Why?
What's the rationale this school of thought provides for deciding the enemy just can't be decisively defeated? The underlying strategic belief, as the source presents it, is that the enemy structure, whether it's a terror organization or a state proxy, is just too diffuse, too resilient, maybe too deeply embedded in the civilian population to be permanently vanquished by military force alone.
So if you accept that a decisive win and hatra is impossible,
then you have to shift your goal from winning to managing. And the alternative strategy, as taught in this doctrine, is what they call limited confrontation, imut mugbal.
Limited confrontation, that sounds less like a war and more like a permanent controlled skirmish, a low-grade fever that never breaks.
That's exactly the intention, according to the source. It's not a war designed for a knockout blow. It's a skirmish focused on managing terror organizations within what they deem to be acceptable parameters. And the ultimate objective, instead of defeating them, is to achieve what they call an arrangement, hazara.
An arrangement, what does that actually look like in practice, and how is the military supposed to?
The source says the ultimate goal of Hazara, or this longed-for peace, is achieved by what they call steering the enemy in the right direction.
Steering them?
Yes, using a mix of limited force, economic levers, diplomatic pressure, all orchestrated by the security establishment to guide the adversary toward a predetermined political outcome. The source specifically notes that this doctrine includes making the separation from the Palestinians' Hipardut Mea Palestinae, an embedded goal within the IDF's own operational doctrine.
So you're turning a military organization into the primary driver of a very specific and very controversial political solution.
That's the allegation. The military transforms from a body that executes force to achieve victory into a body that manages conflict to achieve a political outcome, an outcome they themselves have defined.
And that brings us to a crucial point in the source material, connecting this whole shift to the military's traditional role.
Indeed. The source asserts that a truly professional military should only give a simple answer to the political echelon. That answer should be, I can do this, or I cannot.
That's it.
That's it. It should not, under any circumstances, concern itself with the question of price or cost beyond calculating the resources and time required for the mission.
But hold on, in modern conflicts, isn't considering the cost, things like international law, civilian casualties, relations with the U.S., the political fallout of a hostage deal, isn't that a vital strategic necessity for any responsible government?
It is for the government, but the source argues that the moment the military executive body starts integrating these non-military factors into its own operational planning and advice, the moment it starts worrying about a future inquiry commission or the impact on U.S. military aid or the complexities of hostage talks, it actively harms its purely military execution capability.
How does worrying about the price tag, so to speak, hurt military execution?
According to this critique, it weakens what they call the force application muscle. When the commander, who is supposed to be singularly focused on feasibility and execution, starts acting like a diplomat or a political strategist, he begins to find reasons not to use force, or to use it only in the most limited, cautious way.
Ah, I see.
The source suggests this philosophical overreach transforms the army from a ready body of execution into a body of political resistance, a body that often fights against the political will to enter a decisive conflict and often succeeds in stalling or limiting operation. The professional boundaries are completely erased.
So, in essence, the argument is that by taking on the role of strategist, diplomat, and politician, the commanders sacrifice their one unique military objective, achieving victory when ordered, stating the cost truthfully, but not letting that cost become a veto on the mission itself.
That is the source's core thesis. They believe this intellectual framework creates a security establishment that uses its specialized knowledge and its professional aura to manipulate the political sphere, ensuring their desired arrangement is pursued, even if it requires deceiving the political echelon and the public along the way.
Okay, this is where the theory becomes, according to the source, institutionalized fact. This isn't just some abstract idea floating around an academic seminar. The source material names names, and it names institutions that allegedly cemented this doctrine. So where was this philosophy taught, and who are the specific, powerful figures that are cited as having passed through this school of thought?
The institutional history is it's essential to understanding the depth of this influence. The source notes that this slippery slope began roughly 30 years ago with the creation of MALTAM.
MALTAM.
It stands for the Military Thought and Methodology Institute, and Naveh established it. The primary critique is that this institute effectively systematized the blurring of those lines we just talked about. It turned military doctrine into what the source dismissively calls confused terminology.
So what was MALTAM trying to do originally? What is military thought and methodology in this context, and what are we talking about when we say confused terminology?
Well, initially, you could argue that institutions like MALTAM were probably intended to encourage advanced systemic thinking, forcing commanders to look beyond simple, linear battlefield planning. But the source argues it devolved very quickly into a kind of academic jargon that replaced clear military objectives.
For example?
So instead of focusing on maneuver and destruction of the enemy, the lexicon became dominated by concepts like limited confrontation, which we've discussed, and the central idea of the commander as statesman. Hamafik Commandanai.
The commander as statesman. I mean, that one phrase really encapsulates the entire doctrinal shift, doesn't it? It explicitly says the commander is expected to operate as a diplomatic and political and not just a military one.
It does. And the source mentions other examples of this jargon, complex systems theories, terminology that critics felt just obscured simple objectives with unnecessary intellectualization. The argument is that this institutionalized the belief that commanders should be political thinkers, strategic gatekeepers, and complex systems managers. And that, in turn, justified their interference in political matters.
But MALTAM was eventually shut. Did that stop the...
No, not at all. It was replaced by the Dato Institute, which functions as the military school for senior command today. The source claims that the Dato Institute is a body that has lost its way in a big way and just continues the negative influence started by Naveh's earlier efforts.
So the philosophical pipeline just stayed open.
It stayed open, ensuring the continuous propagation of this limited confrontation and commander as statesman minds.
All right, let's get to the A-list graduate. The source makes an extraordinarily strong claim here, almost a comprehensive one. It says Naveh's influence spans decades and has affected every single senior officer right up to the very eve of the recent attack. The language they use is all were his...
It's a powerful assertion about the uniformity of strategic culture at the very top. And the source lists specific figures, not just any officers, but the decisive strategic leaders for the last decade plus. Benny Gantz, Gadi Eisenkot, and Aviv Kochavi, all former chiefs of staff.
The three of them.
All three. And also cited is Amir Eshel, the former Air Force.
So if the source is correct, the entire strategic direction of the IDF for over 10 years was managed by individuals who were steeped in a philosophy that rejected the concept of decisive victory and actually encouraged political orchestration.
That's the argument.
And that would explain why Gantz was the one who brought Naveh back in 2013, solidifying the doctrine's return to the official fold.
Exactly. The source suggests a powerful self-reinforcing network. And the critique doesn't just stop with the retired generals. It targets figures who were actively in command during and after the failures of October 7. It criticizes their philosophical preparation while at the same time noting Naveh's high regard.
Who are these post-October 7 figures that are specifically named by the...
Well, the source names Major General Yaron Finkelman, who's the current head of Southern Command. Naveh reportedly described him during the course as amazing. The list also includes Aaron Haliva, the former head of AMN military intelligence. Now, Haliva took responsibility for the intelligence failure, but he's nonetheless described as being praised and lauded by Naveh. The source uses these examples to show that professional failure, even catastrophic failure, didn't seem to erode the deep ideological loyalty or respect within this philosophical cohort.
And the source singles out the current Air Force Commander, Tomer Bar, with a very specific and very high level.
Yes, this is a big one. Tomer Bar is described as perhaps the most impressive character in the Corps. The source suggests he is such a crucial figure and so philosophically aligned with this doctrine that anyone aiming to become Chief of Staff must pass through him or consult with him.
What's the implication there?
The implication is critical. It's that the doctrine hasn't just infiltrated the highest ranks, it now operates as a powerful institutional filter. It ensures that only those who pass this philosophical litmus test can achieve the absolute pinnacle of command.
It really paints a picture of a closed system, one designed for philosophical replication. But the influence goes beyond just the source details some very, very contentious guest lecturers who were invited to teach the top brass. And this gives us some insight into the complex, sometimes radical perspectives the course.
That's right. These courses were aimed at the very highest echelon. Generals, heads of Mossad, heads of Shin Bet, and Naveh reportedly wanted to bring in a Palestinian personality to give the Palestinian perspective. Hussein Sheikh was mentioned as a possibility.
Okay, so why is the potential invitation of Hussein Sheikh so contentious and so significant in the source?
The source connects this specific individual directly to serious violence. It cites a Jerusalem District Court ruling and uses this legal document to detail that Sheikh was allegedly involved in providing both money and 2 hand grenades to a terrorist responsible for a 2002 suicide bombing that killed 2 Israelis. So the source is highlighting the radical complexity of the perspective being sought. The claim is that the highest-ranking officers were potentially being exposed and asked to engage with individuals implicated in deadly terror attacks. And this was all done under the guise of intellectual engagement that was supposedly necessary for achieving that goal of arrangement.
That dramatically stretches the boundaries of traditional military. Who else was brought in that crosses these traditional lines? Security and highly sensitive domestic.
The source mentions Roni Elsh. He's the former deputy head of Shin Bet and later became police. He's described as very sophisticated and very thoughtful. His invitation reflects the doctrine's interest in figures who operate at that intersection of security and complex legal or political investigation, a continued focus on the dynamics of the blue echelon.
And then there's the figure who the source claims was Peraz's best sir in the court, Crush Barner.
Yes. Barner was a police officer known for his role in key investigations into the then Prime Minister, Netanyahu. Naveh reportedly described him as the best officer in the last course and specifically highlighted his role as investigator.
And what's the source's interpretation of that praise?
It's key. It suggests that in the Naveh method, the ideal officer is no longer the most brilliant battlefield. The ideal officer is the one most capable of understanding, navigating, and influencing the domestic, political, and legal spheres, even when that means operating against the sitting elected leadership.
So the training ground wasn't just teaching strategy, it was teaching the strategic importance of legal and political maneuvering. If the commander's job is to manage the state from within, then things like political investigations and the rule of law become tools, or at least highly relevant data for the military strategy.
Absolutely. The training ground reinforced this belief that the highest ranks of the security establishment must view themselves as indispensable, sophisticated actors. Not merely executors of policy, but shapers of policy, regardless of the explicit democratic chain of command. And this leads us directly into the source's claims about the politicization of the military establishment in practice.
Right.
So we connect all this to the bigger picture. The source presents a critique of a fundamental and, in their view, illegal shift in the operational relationship between the elected government, the democratic civilian sphere, and the military apparatus.
And this isn't just about the military offering professional advice.
Not at all. The source alleges it's a deep structural encroachment into the strategic and political space.
And the source maintains this is a taught, institutionalized behavior.
That's the entire claim, that officers are indoctrinated with the idea that they must think politic because the officer operates within the state and is the true steward of its long-term future. The doctrine allegedly encourages the idea that while they aren't elected, they have to operate as gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers against what?
Protecting the state from decisions they deem unwise, transient, or populist political maneuvers from the elected official.
But the source contends that this very act of thinking politics is what fundamentally undermines the military's primary function.
Correct. Their core military function is damaged because the commander's focus shifts. When they become obsessed with the complexities of the blue echelon collecting intelligence on its intentions, anticipating its failures, they inevitably weaken their focus on the red echelon, the actual enemy.
The inversion of priorities you mentioned earlier.
It's a complete inversion. The source explicitly claims that, according to Naveh's philosophy, military personnel must be more sophisticated in collecting intelligence on the political layer than on the enemy layer.
Okay, so this brings us to the operational reality of it all. Subordination and or what the source calls the practical application of tabula against the government. How does the source claim this philosophical mindset translates into real-world action against the political echelon?
The source claims that senior military leadership, we're talking generals, the chief of staff, have perfected methods like using discretion or a subtle head nod to basically circumvent the explicit direction of the prime minister or the defense minister, a figurative one. The result, the source alleges, is that they ultimately execute only what they believe is right, regardless of the democratic instruction. The source is, it's scathing here. It calls the idea that the career military servant is just professional, a fantasy, and a non-true legend.
That is a direct accusation of functional insubordination. The source must have some specific, concrete examples to back up a claim that massive.
It provides several. Focusing on the recent conflict, the source alleges specific high-stakes operational orders that were reportedly ignored or stalled by the military executive.
Like what?
Take the example regarding humanitarian aid and the buffer zone. The Prime Minister reportedly issued a direct order to the Chief of Staff, requiring him to prepare plans within 48 hours for two specific objectives.
And what were those objectives?
First, preparing specific plans for preventing aid from reaching Hamas, the enemy, and second, preparing plans for creating a secure humanitarian complex south of the Morag axis. This was presented as a high-priority, time-sensitive directive from the elected leader.
And the outcome, according to the source's critique.
The source claims these plans were simply never produced, never provided, not within the 48-hour time frame, and perhaps not ever. The source uses this to argue that the military leadership utilized its discretion, its self-appointed strategic authority, to ignore or stall a politically inconvenient order.
So a veto through bureaucratic inaction.
Exactly. They resisted the order rather than executing.
Okay, let's move to high-profile military act, the ultimate test of a fighting. What claims does the source make regarding entering critical areas or targeting high-value individuals?
A similar pattern of coordinated resistance is alleged. The source claims that when the political echelon made strategic decisions, like wanting to enter Rafah or wanting to eliminate the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, the security system, and they specifically cite the Chief of Staff and Defense Minister Gallant united against the move.
And the source sees this unified resistance not as legitimate professional debate,
but as institutional coordination, a united front to block the political will.
But hold on. Advising against a high-risk operation like taking out Nasrallah or a full-scale invasion of Rafah, isn't that often considered the military's professional duty to warn of the consequences? Where does the source claim the line was crossed into manipulation?
The source alleges the manipulation was designed specifically to guarantee the operation would be aborted. That is the functional definition of tabula. In the case of eliminating Nasrallah, Defense Minister Gallant, who the source is very quick to remind you is a graduate of this very philosophy, is cited as allegedly demanding a phone call to the American. Now, this wasn't framed as consultation, but as a demand to update them or ask for permission.
And the source's interpretation of that move?
The source claims that Gallant made this demand knowing full well that involving the Americans at that specific stage on such a sensitive operation would inevitably lead to a lengthy political process, a process that would effectively guarantee the operation would be killed or, at the very least, indefinitely stalled.
So it was a sophisticated political veto disguised as proper diplomatic procedure.
That's the allegation. Orchestrating events to ensure the military's desired outcome, in this case, avoiding a massive regional escalation, rather than executing the political leadership's demand, which was to eliminate the threat.
That is a very detailed example of the alleged tabula in action. And what is the overarching strategic argument the military allegedly uses to halt these operations that the source finds so objectionable?
The source claims the military often resorts to the argument of strategic madness, malkat strategic. They warn the government that the proposed action, while maybe militarily feasible, is strategically reckless.
And the source's critique of that is?
The critique is severe. The source basically says, what business is it of yours if it's strategic matter? You are a body of execution. You were asked to do it, so do it. The argument is that the military has no legitimate discretion on the fundamental question of execution once a decision is made by the cabinet. Their sole professional function is to state the feasibility and the price, but not to offer a veto based on their own strategic political concepts.
Wow.
And this systemic manipulation brings us to what the source considers the ultimate example of this doctrine succeeding. The heads of the services themselves coordinating against the prime minister.
This is the maneuver that Naveh reportedly praised as a colossal achievement.
Yes, exactly. Naveh is quoted as praising an instance where 3 heads of services allegedly organized themselves against the government for what they believed was for the good of the state. He described this act in almost theatrical terms as a colossal, forcing the prime minister to dance with you when he doesn't want to dance.
And who are the individuals allegedly involved in this coordinated?
Gabi Ashkenazi, Mir Dagan, and Yuval Disk, the respective heads of the IDF, Mossad, and Shin Bet.
And the source points out a striking dissonance of those praise.
A huge dissonance. It notes that Naveh simultaneously called Ashkenazi a Neville, which means a scoundrel or a disgrace, in the very same breath as he praised him for this strategic political.
What's the significance of that?
It's crucial because it implies that within this doctrine, the ends successfully circumventing the political echelon for what the military believes is right justifies working with ethically questionable characters and method. The maneuver is more important than the man.
So the source is painting this powerful system where the commanders see themselves as the indispensable ultimate arbiters of national security, not just the instruments of the democratic process. They don't follow. They steer. They manipulate.
That is the core accusation against the Naveh method. The officer is taught to be the individual who molds the prime minister's decision to fit the military's own long-term interests and its own understanding of Hasdora of arrangement. And if the security establishment is consistently fighting against entering a war and winning that internal fight by using techniques like tabula against its own government, then its fundamental nature has shifted from a fighting force to a political man.
The alleged consequences of this philosophical shift, according to the source, are profound. They link the doctrine direct and a breakdown in the chain of command that. So let's talk about the practical price paid for this focus.
The sources paint a very stark image regarding the operational state of the military. They argue that this overwhelming emphasis on political maneuvering and non-military external consideration, worrying about U.S. sanctions, anticipating international inquiry committees, prioritizing specific hostage negotiation outcomes, has fundamentally weakened the Army's actual force application.
And this decline is attributed to what the source calls pietism. We need to define that term clearly in this context. What do they mean by that?
Pietism here refers to a kind of self-righteous moral superiority, a reluctance to use decisive force. It's the idea that the military leadership believes it is intellectually and morally superior to the political leadership and is therefore justified in vetoing actions that might be messy or violent, even if those actions are necessary for victory.
That's a strong charge.
It is. The source is extremely harsh, calling the entire system contemptible, bazuya, for allegedly sacrificing thousands of soldiers on the altar of pietism.
So the doctrine encouraged a moral reluctance that diminished tactical readiness. What was the practical result?
According to the source, the military establishment was accused of actively fighting against going to war, and often succeeding in that fight, using bureaucratic delays or strategic vetoes, like that strategic madness argument.
So the army was fighting its own government.
The Army, which should be a body solely focused on fighting the enemy, was instead described as fighting first and foremost the political will of its own government to enter a conflict. The source concludes that this resulted in a situation where the concept of using force aggressively and decisively atrophied over time. It left the Army unprepared when comprehensive force application was suddenly demanded.
And this brings us to the most painful connections makes, linking the doctrine directly to October 7, to the catastrophic operational and intelligence.
The connection is explicit. The source names Naveh's graduates, including Major General Yaron Finkelman, head of Southern Command, and Aaron Haliva, head of AMAN, as key figures from the October 7 failures.
But the claim goes deeper than just a personnel failure, right?
Yeah. Much deeper. It suggests the philosophical framework itself contributed to the disaster. The focus on limited confrontation meant relying on sophisticated technological barriers and small, targeted strikes. These are the tools of management. It did not mean maintaining the large, ready maneuver force and the strategic posture required for decisive defeat. They were intellectually prepared for a manageable skirmish, not a war.
They prepared for the enemy they wanted to face, one that sought an arrangement, not the enemy that actually existed, which sought destruction.
Precisely. They assumed the enemy was interested in Hasdora, rather than a full-scale hakra against Israel. And this inherent intellectual underestimation, which the source says is derived directly from the doctrine, contributed to the catastrophic lack of preparedness.
The source even connects the philosophy to the catastrophic failure to notify the political leadership when the attack began. The whole issue of not waking the prime minister.
And that is a staggering implication. The source suggests that the doctrine is fundamentally responsible for that failure. I mean, think about it. If the philosophy teaches you that you are the ultimate strategic arbiter, that you know better than the political layer, and if you are accustomed to manipulating or circumventing that layer through tabula,
then in those critical early hours,
then the commander's impulse to manage the crisis internally, believing it was just another limited confrontation, superseded the democratic requirement to immediately inform and involve the political echelon.
So the strategic arrogance born from this commander, a statesman philosophy, allegedly played a direct role in the failure of immediate command and control. It isolated the political leadership at the worst possible time.
It connects the highest theoretical training, the mitzvah as the complex handler, to the most devastating operational failure of the command structure. The gatekeepers believed they could handle the situation without intervention from the blue echelon.
Finally, let's look at the source's claims regarding the current high-level tension. This philosophical legacy of orchestration appears to be playing out in real time, creating what the source calls a profound crisis of trust.
It does. The source connects the Naveh Method directly to the current state of high-level tension and mistrust we see today. Examples cited include the reported friction between the defense minister's office and the IDF spokesperson's unit,
which raises deep public questions about the actual chain of command.
Yes. Who is subordinate to whom? In the face of an ongoing conflict, it becomes unclear.
And how is this tension manifesting at the very top between the chief of staff and the political leadership?
The source claims that public statements made by the chief of staff are being viewed by the political echelon and critics as nothing less than a semi-political attack on the defense minister. The claim isn't just that the chief of staff is offering professional opinion, but that he is adopting the posture of a political rival, leveraging his professional position to campaign for a particular strategic direction.
So the source's core conclusion is that this attempt by security establishment seniors to circumvent and manipulate the political hasn't remained some secret tactic. It's become routine and openly visible in the public.
Absolutely. The source concludes that if you want to understand the erosion of strategic focus and the current crisis of civil-military trust, the answer is found with Shimon. The implication is that the erosion of a single-minded focus on military victory and its replacement with political entanglement and the tabula doctrine has hollowed out the functional effectiveness of the fighting force, creating a parallel, often resistant political power structure that is masquerading as a professional army.
To
just summarize the central provocative claims we've analyzed from this source material, we have looked at a specific military philosophy, the Naveh Method, which was, it is claimed, widely taught to the country's most senior security figures.
Right.
This philosophy allegedly achieved a systematic transformation. It de-emphasized decisive military victory, hatra. It promoted active political intervention and the strategic manipulation tabla of the political tier. And ultimately, it is claimed, it weakened the nation's ability to use force effectively because its leaders were taught to fight against decisive conflict in favor of a perpetual arrangement.
It's a profound deep dive into the nature of institutional power and intellectual drift. The source, in its very harsh critique, posits that if the military is unwilling or unable to achieve victory, its leaders should take your things and move.
Stark choice.
It is. And it raises an important question that builds on everything we've discussed about this balance between professional advice versus democratic command. It's a question for you listening at home to think about. In a democracy, when does the professional obligation of a military leader to offer critical strategic advice, to warn of what they see as strategic madness, when does that cross the invisible line into the unauthorized political maneuvering and orchestration that the source alleged finds the Naveh?
It really forces you to consider the very moment when expertise becomes an instrument of undemocratic control. That is the question this doctrine leaves hanging in the air. Where is the line drawn between giving a professional risk assessment and actively manipulating the domestic political environment to ensure a specific military-preferred policy outcome?
A tough and, I think, existential question for any nation that relies on clear democratic civility. Thank you for joining us. Hence Deep Dive.